June 21st, 1995.
All right, would you hand the right-hand glove to Mr. Simpson, please?
Last week, he struggled with the bloody gloves, but today, a new pair.
I think they fit quite well. They appeared to fit him snug and tight, pretty much the way the gloves were designed.
Does today's demonstration mean a recovery for the prosecution?
These gloves would fit almost every male in America, these new gloves, and especially since they've been stretched.
Tonight, the state versus O.J. Simpson. The gloves, the phone logs. The prosecution starts to wind up its case.
This is ABC News Nightline. Reporting from Washington, Ted Koppel.
It's becoming increasingly difficult to remember that O.J. Simpson ever did anything other than sit impassively handsome, flanked by expensive lawyers, listening to endless hours of testimony about his shoes, his gloves, his socks, and, of course, his blood. Tomorrow morning in court, but not in the presence of the jury, statisticians will attempt to explain how the DNA in Mr. Simpson's blood is such that it establishes him alone and unique, not only among the 5 billion humans who occupy this globe, but mathematically well beyond that number. It is a concept that seems more philosophical than statistical, which may be why so much more time and effort is being expended on the gloves. We non-statisticians are comfortable with the gloves. We believe at least that we can comprehend the gloves. They fit him or they didn't. And if they didn't, that either disqualifies Mr. Simpson as a legitimate suspect in this case, or they shrunk. These are digestible concepts with which we are all familiar, and the prosecution was probably wise in devoting another chapter of its efforts toward convincing the jury today that even if the gloves didn't seem to fit last week, once upon a time, they did. Here's a report from Judy Muller in Los Angeles.
When prosecutors announced yesterday that they're close to wrapping up their case, Chris Darden could not resist throwing down a verbal gauntlet.
Mr. Cochran, you've been mouthing off for the past 12 months. Okay, Johnny. All right. You know, these are baseless allegations of conspiracies and contamination and the like. Now's the time to put up or shut up.
And Johnny Cochran could not resist picking up that gauntlet, literally.
I've got 4 words for Chris Darden and the prosecution. The gloves didn't fit. Bye.
Cochran was referring to the hastily mounted demonstration last week in which the prosecution asked Simpson to don the gloves, one from the murder scene, the other recovered at Simpson's estate. It was a demonstration that backfired, triggering a debate over whether the gloves were actually too small for Simpson or whether he was simply trying his best to make them appear that way. Prosecutors contended the gloves were a tight fit because they'd shrunk and because Simpson tried them on over latex gloves. Today, Darden asked the court for permission to try again, this time using new gloves identical to those used in the crime.
Except this time we won't have the crime scene gloves, and Mr. Simpson won't have the opportunity at that time to put on latex gloves and jack around with us and play games with us in front of the jury.
Ito agreed to allow the demonstration to take place, but this time the prosecutors were taking no chances. They had their glove expert, Richard Rubin, measure the defendant's hands before the jury was brought into court to make sure the new gloves would fit. And once the jury was present, they drove home the point that the crime scene gloves would have fit Simpson in their original condition.
So is it your testimony that the gloves marked 401 are the same make, model, style, and style as the glove from Rockingham and Bundy?
Yes, they are.
Cochran, in an effort to dampen any damage from the upcoming demonstration, tried to focus the jury on the actual gloves in evidence.
With regard to the gloves that you saw last week and the gloves in evidence here, you cannot tell this jury whether those gloves were shrunk in 1990, 1991, 92, 93, 94. Can you?
No, I cannot.
Is it correct, sir, that 99.5% of all males in America could wear an extra large glove?
Yes.
After more than 2 hours of this sort of maneuvering, the prosecution finally got down to take 2 on the gloves, but with Judge Ito taking control of all the stage directions this time around.
All right, let me ask counsel to be seated. And Mr. Simpson, would you please step over to the podium? And Mr. Rubin, would you, you've removed the forming inserts?
Yes, I did.
All right, and would you, I think we need to cut the string that's in between them. Can you just pull those apart? Thank you. All right, would you hand the right-hand glove to Mr. Simpson, please?
We have Mr. Simpson back to the podium.
Your Honor.
No comments, counsel. I'll direct it. And Mr. Simpson, would you please, however, stand at the podium? Thank you. Turn to your right, please. All right, Mr. Dartmouth, you have a seat, please?
I'm just trying to see the demonstration.
Counsel, be seated, please. All right, Mr. Rubin, would you give Mr. Simpson the left glove, please? All right, Mr. Simpson, would you show your hands to the jury, please? Front and back. All right, thank you, sir. All right. And would you remove the gloves and give them back to Mr. Rubin, please?
Darden, obviously frustrated at having his view of the demonstration blocked, had to resort to asking the witness what he had seen.
Can you give us your opinion regarding the fit of the glove on Mr. Simpson's hand?
I think they did quite well.
But Cochran was not about to let that be the last word.
What that demonstration by the prosecution just showed us is that Mr. Simpson would be like 99.5% of all males in America. Is that correct? Are you putting the gloves on?
That's correct.
All right.
What Darden failed to do at this point was to remind the jury what they had heard last week, that only 200 pairs of these gloves in that size, style, and color had been sold in the United States. And court observers say the jurors did not seem as focused on today's demonstration as the previous one. But the jury did pay close attention to some new evidence, phone calls made by O.J. Simpson on his cellular phone the day and night of the murders. Llewellyn Robertson, a record keeper for the AirTouch Cellular Company, testified that Simpson made a 3-minute 9-second call to Nicole Brown's home at 2:18 p.m. on the afternoon of June 12th. Shortly after hanging up from that call, Simpson placed 4 calls in rapid succession to Paula Barbieri, trying both her home in Los Angeles and her home in Florida with no success. Even though his calls went unanswered, Simpson let the phone ring and ring.
Correct.
Can you tell us what is the actual duration of that phone call?
1 minute and 30 seconds.
Prosecutors seem to be implying that allowing the phone to repeatedly ring that long showed a state of frantic agitation. Simpson tried to reach Barbieri again that evening from his car phone, again to no avail. But the timing of the 2 calls, just after 10 p.m., is critical. That would place Simpson in his Bronco shortly before the prosecution contends the murders were committed at 10:15 p.m., rather than at home, as the defense has contended. Barbieri, whom the defense has portrayed as Simpson's steady girlfriend at that time, was at neither of the numbers Simpson was trying to reach. An attorney for the Mirage Hotel in Las Vegas told the jury that Barbieri stayed there on June 12th in a room guaranteed with the credit card of singer Michael Bolton. Another Simpson friend, Kansas City Chiefs running back Marcus Allen, was also in the news today. A judge in Kansas City ruled that Allen would not have to comply with the defense request to testify in Simpson's trial. That could not have been good news to a defense team that has already lost some witnesses. Of course, as the judge pointed out to the jury, they don't have to call any witnesses at all.
As you recollect, the defense has no obligation whatsoever, as I instructed you at the beginning of the case, to present any evidence at all. So at this point, all we're certain is that the prosecution may be concluding their case by the end of next week.
While the defense is not obligated to present evidence, the jury will no doubt be waiting to see if Cochran can support the theories he offered in his opening statement, primarily that O.J. Simpson was framed by racist cops in a rush to judgment. Clearly, Darden thought Cochran would have trouble doing so when he offered his challenge yesterday to, quote, put up or shut up. Ted?
Judy, thank you. When we come back, we'll be joined by our 2 legal consultants, Leslie Abramson and Robert Filibosian.
This is ABC News Nightline, brought to you by AT&T.
And we're joined now from Los Angeles by our 2 legal consultants, former Los Angeles District Attorney Robert Filibosian and Defense Attorney Leslie Abramson. I am almost reduced to saying, what do you guys want to talk about? But not quite. Let's go another round on the gloves, Leslie. Terribly important, wasn't it, that the prosecution spend that extra time today?
Well, it's important for them to do whatever they can to undo what most people perceive as the debacle of the evidence gloves from last week. Now, whether they succeeded in undoing it or merely focused the jury's attention on how significant that demonstration was, we really can't know since we're not the jurors. But I don't think the demonstration today was entirely successful in solving the problem of why the evidence gloves are so shrunken from their original size when the blood on them couldn't have caused that shrinkage.
Who says that? Who says the blood on them couldn't have caused it?
Actually, Mr. Rubin said it because Johnny Cochran asked him if 3 cc's of liquid, which is how much blood was on the gloves, could have shrunk them to 15% that they appear to have shrunken, and the witness said no.
And so what we're left with is the notion that why? Because the gloves were too small, therefore he couldn't. I mean, he showed that he could get them on. He showed, as one of my colleagues, Never Tires, of pointing out to me, that he could grasp a marker, which was substituting, I guess, for a knife. Why does that prove anything? So maybe they were a little small.
Well, go back to Dr. Lakshmanan's testimony, the coroner's testimony about the efficiency and speed and purposefulness of this attack. I mean, he claimed that the way the stab wounds were inflicted, the fact that 2 victims were killed within a very short period of time, required someone athletic and strong and dexterous. Now, if you're wearing gloves that are too tight, you're not moving that well. You're not handling the knife that well. But even apart from that, logic does come in once in a while, I guess, into our thinking about this case. And the issue is why, if he's going to go off to kill people, is he going to wear gloves that restrict his movement in his hands, gloves that are too tight, gloves that are too small, when we know he had all these other gloves sitting at his house, including golf gloves and other gloves that he could have worn.
And yet, Bob, I guess I'm reduced to saying if someone is going off and has the intent of murdering his ex-wife, maybe he'll just reach for the first pair of gloves that he can find. So what?
I doubt, Ted, you're right. I doubt if he went around his house trying on various pairs of gloves to see which ones would fit. And it may be that those gloves had shrunk to some extent before they got wet with the victim's blood. And let's not forget that the gloves do, in fact, have his blood and the victim's blood on them.
But let us set aside for a moment, Bob, what you and Leslie and I may think about those gloves. The importance, of course, is the impact that demonstration last week had on the jury, and to what degree today's demonstration with the new pair of gloves may have undone that damage. What do you think?
The prosecution very definitely engaged in damage control, and they had to engage in that damage control. But I think we sometimes, as the commentators and the reporters, tend to take some of these notable incidents out of context. We're looking at a lot of other things. The jurors are only fixated on what they're seeing in the courtroom, and they're seeing many, many things besides the glove demonstration. They will probably fit that in with more perspective than we have applied to it, especially when the attorneys start their argument. And I think Marcia Clark is very eager to get to that argument so she can start drawing all of the inferences from all of the evidence that they have in this case, take the focus away from individual demonstrations which may have gone awry.
We're going to leave the gloves in just a moment, I promise, but I just want to ask one more question. The reason, as a non-professional observer, I think the gloves may be so important is precisely, as I said at the beginning of the program, because they are so easily understandable, and things like DNA can be so confusing. And the sense I think we all had in watching the jurors, the rapt attention, the fact that some of them were taking notes, leads me to believe that maybe, when all is said and done, it's going to have more of an impact. What do you think, Leslie?
Yeah, I think there's that, and I also think, let's not forget, these are tape-recorded proceedings. I can't imagine that Johnny Cochran won't play the tape of that demonstration for that jury in final argument, so that just in case they missed it, or any part of it while they were taking notes, they can see that glove demonstration once again.
I don't mean to be flip about this, but I'm really shocked to hear you say that. You mean we may actually have reruns within this case?
Yes, but no residuals are paid for those reruns.
No, but I mean, I'm serious.
I'm serious, too.
We could actually have a half hour or an hour of testimony from 6 months ago or 3 months ago being replayed by both the prosecution and the defense?
Why not?
I'm just asking.
Yes, of course, it could happen. Absolutely.
Does that happen frequently?
I mean, if
cases?
the prosecution gets up there, no, it doesn't happen frequently. How many cases have been, recorded gavel to gavel? Very few. But if the prosecution gets up there and in any way tries to characterize that glove trying on episode in a way that's contrary to what's on that videotape, there is no question the defense and argument will be able to play that tape.
God,
I don't think the jurors have seen the end of that glove demonstration.
What a horrifying thought. We may yet get replays of all of this. Let's take a break. We'll be back in just a moment. And we're back with Bob Filibosian and Leslie Abramson. Bob, what about the phone calls that O.J. Simpson apparently made at a time when, I think, if memory serves, his attorneys had said he was back at home. He wasn't in his car.
Those phone calls, especially the one I think at 10:03 to Paula Barbieri, indicates he was in his car and not in the house. And if he was in his car and on his way over to Nicole Brown's house, that's certainly very, very important evidence. It also, as you say, really undercuts the alibi that he was home at that time. If he was home, he wouldn't have to use his car phone.
Now, Leslie, before the program, the three of us were talking about what we would be discussing, and you made a fascinating point about how the prosecution appears to be adjusting its case based upon what it has heard from dismissed jurors. Talk about that for a moment.
Well, it's amazing. You try to make strategic decisions in the course of a trial based on your thinking about what the jury is thinking. For example, just to go back for 1 second, whatever the glove demonstration may look like to us, it clearly looks like something to the lawyers involved because they're all making a big deal out of it. They sense that it has impact on that jury. And as you're making strategic decisions in a trial, you're trying to figure out what matters and doesn't matter to your jury. In this case, unlike any other, you have dismissed jurors talking about their take on the evidence. And so when the prosecution heard from these dismissed jurors that the domestic violence evidence had virtually no impact or was trivial to them or was somehow counterproductive to the prosecution, that assisted them in making the strategic decision they made in the last couple of days to not put on any more domestic violence evidence. And that is very unusual to have sort of an ongoing dialogue, if you will, with members of the once jury telling you what's going over well and what isn't. It's amazing.
Is it actually permissible, Bob, for the prosecution to go back to some of those jurors and talk to them now? I mean, if it's all right for us to talk to them, can the prosecution?
No, the prosecution cannot talk to those jurors, and it would be improper for the prosecution to do so. But there's a danger in listening to those jurors who, for one reason or another, have been released from the case by Judge Ito. They have various axes to grind, and they are saying things that may not necessarily reflect what other jurors are thinking. And there is a danger to following Leslie's argument in that sense and doing these mid-course corrections. I think they left off the domestic violence because it's redundant, it's repetitive, and also I think they want to get this case to the jury before they lose any more jurors. And also I think Marcia Clark is very eager to start her argument to this jury and draw all of her inferences.
Again, going back to what we were discussing before we went on the air, you both seem to be of the opinion that it's very important for the prosecution to end its case with something of a bang. What's left?
We don't know what they might have, and I think they're probably being very careful to conceal that. They have to tell the defense, obviously, what evidence they have, but they don't have to tell the defense how they're going to present it. I was expecting that the shoe evidence would have more bang than it did, and it would probably be their concluding evidence. Obviously, it didn't have enough bang to be the concluding evidence, so we've already seen it, and it's done and over with. I still suspect there's something there in the bottom of their bag of tricks that they'll bring out.
Maybe the hat. Maybe we're going to go from gloves and shoes to hats.
Just in the few seconds that we've got left, Leslie, tell me where we go from here. So the defense then may or may not put on a lengthy case. How many more times will we hear from each of the sides?
Well, first of all, what the prosecution still has a few things to do. They have hair and fiber evidence that they've talked about. Maybe they have some connection, with what I was just mentioning, the watch cap. Then they rest. Then the defense puts on their evidence. Then the prosecution has a right to do what's known as rebuttal. And then the defense has a right to do what's known as SUR, S-U-R, rebuttal. And at that point, the case should end.
And then is that when we hear one member of the prosecution, one member of the defense, then making the final case summation to the jury?
Not necessarily just one, since this is, this has been group action on both sides. The judge allowed the prosecution to use 2 attorneys to make their opening statement. He may well allow more than one prosecutor to make either their original summation or what's known as their closing argument, their rebuttal argument. It's possible he'll let more than one person argue, although only in capital cases is that really mandated by law.
All right, so we still have, Bob, in the last couple of seconds left to us, we still have many weeks to go.
I would expect we're probably looking at another 2 months before this case actually goes to the jury, allowing time for the defense to put on its case, allowing time for argument, and I think that after that, then we're looking at about 8 more weeks.
Thank you both, Bob Filibosian, Leslie Abramson. Always nice to have you with us. I'll be back in just a moment. Tomorrow on Good Morning America, filibusters explained how one senator can halt the legislative process just by talking. That's tomorrow morning on this ABC station. And that's our report for tonight. I'm Ted Koppel in Washington. For all of us here at ABC News, good night.
For information about Nightline on America Online, call 1-800-772-4222. For videocassette inquiries, call 1-800-913-3434. The price is $29.95, plus $4 for shipping and handling.
Nightline is a presentation of ABC News. More Americans get their news from ABC News than from any other source.